Okay, class, we're in module 4, so we're making progress. Now remember, this module is only 1 week long, as are all the subsequent models until we get to modules until we get to a module 11. This one is going to be about a couple formulas for understanding stress that have become kind of basic to all the subsequent formulas. Very important that you understand these, and so we're going to explore both how Hill went from the truncated roller coaster to the ABCX formula, and then how McCubbin and Patterson took that model and added some stuff to it to make it make more sense, to help it make more sense to us. So without further ado, let's move on to the next slide. So the ABCX formula is, again, Hill's model that was a truncated roller coaster that moved into the ABCX model because he wanted to explain how crisis proneness and freedom from crisis happened among certain families. So he's expanding on his truncated roller coaster. And this model was so important that it became the basis of most family stress models. So this made Hill, in many people's minds, the father of family stress theory. So let's move a little bit into this model. There are 3 pre-crisis variables in this model. These are the variables that happen before the X, which is the crisis. A is the crisis precipitating event, or the stressor. Now remember, the stressor doesn't immediately cause a crisis. Sometimes it can kind of go for a while, and then boom, the family has something that happens, and that stress becomes a crisis. B is the family's ability, the resources that they have to address the crisis, to keep it from happening, to keep it from getting worse, or to deal with it when it gets pretty bad. And then C is the family's definition, or their way of viewing the crisis, how they define the crisis. Some see it as an opportunity for growth, and others see it as a catastrophe. And it could be the exact same thing happening to 2 families, but one sees it as an opportunity, one sees it as a catastrophe. And then X is the crisis. So let's move into these and look at them a little bit more deeply. In 1958, Hill used the term crisis precipitating event and stressor almost in the same way, but it was a situation for which the family has had little or no prior preparation and therefore must be viewed as problematic. Now, the A affects each family member differently based upon the challenges to the family. Remember, family members are not the same just because they're raised in the same family. They've got different psychological makeup, different friends, different supports, different resources. So each family member has a way of looking at the crisis and how it affects them. Whether or not the family sees the crisis as positive or negative is determined by whether or not it leads to some form of hardship for the family. And then not just a single hardship, but many hardships can come out of a crisis. And so that is, that impact on the family defines part of their view. The stressor interacts with the family's resources and their abilities to meet those challenges, and could include things like income changes or living arrangement changes, such as losing your house or moving back in with parents, or even moving in with somebody. Illnesses, role changes both in the family, such as when a mother goes off to serve in the military and the father has to take over her roles, or when a father goes off for a month to the oil rigs or as a ship captain and the mother has to take over his role. And then child discipline problems, which are, we will watch a video a little bit later about the ABCX model from a parenting perspective, parenting of a teen. Let's move on to the next slide. So the family also has resources available to them to determine how they respond to the stressor. A really well-organized family can address stress without going into crisis mode, whereas a less organized family, they're more likely to be pushed by a stressor into the crisis. And crisis management resources can include things like family integration, how well they work together, and family adaptability, how flexible they are to change and to adapting to external and internal crises. Also, the crisis precipitating event and the family's resources come together to interact with the family's view of the event in a process that determines how they view it and what they can do to respond. The definition of the crisis determines how they're going to respond to it, right? For example, in some families, if you disrespect somebody's mother, they'll laugh, and another family, they would go and get their gun and chase the person down, right? So the stress can be viewed differently by different families, and that changes the number of things they can do to respond. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Now, I've already alluded to this to some degree, but the family also defines the stressor, and that definition makes a difference to the family. For Hill, the family's definition is subjective. That means each family would see the same crisis slightly differently because of who they are and the unique collection of individuals and their way of thinking. And that determines whether that family would view it as a hardship or not. One example would be a family with 6 months savings in the bank would look at a big bill as, well, okay, we got the money, so we're going to pay for it. Whereas a family that has, is just living day to day, trying to make ends meet and doesn't have any savings would look at a big bill as a catastrophe, right? So when the family sees the event as a crisis, they're more prone to crisis. When they see it as a challenge to be overcome, they're less prone to a crisis. And then when that event and the family's resources and their definition of the event all come together, A, B, and C, that determines whether or not they proceed to crisis. Okay, next slide. So when these three elements, the A, B, and the C, come together, this precipitates a crisis for some families. Remember that not all families define the thing the same way. So the event, the family's resources, the family's definition, when those three are all in flux and in crisis, crisis is more likely to happen. So Hill hypothesized that families in crises have fluctuating rules and shifting expectations in the family, making the family unstable, which, because they're so focused on the crisis and dealing with the crisis, makes affection difficult to show. It's hard to feel love in a family that's just trying to survive, right, and trying to deal with the next crisis that's coming. And thus, people feel less emotionally satisfied with such families. One major stressor that almost always leads to crisis is the loss of a child. Nobody expects to outlive their children. And so when a child is lost to death, often the marriage falls apart and thus the family falls apart because the stress is so incredibly severe. Now, there were some challenges with this model. It doesn't really address what happens after the crisis. And so McCubbin and Patterson came up with the double ABCX model, to which we turn next. Notice in the double ABCX model, we have this added feature of time at the bottom. So you still got the same A, the stressor. You still got the same B, the existing resources. You still got the same C, definition or perception of the situation. You still got the same X, the crisis. But then you've got some things that happen afterwards. So you see that dotted line between the X and the little a, big A. All right? So this part of the model is what's unique to the double ABCX model. You've got a double A, a double B, a double C, and a double X in the post-crisis phase. So we will define the double A, double B, double C, double X, and then coping and adaptation in the upcoming slides. So if you're ready, let's proceed. Okay, the double ABCX model was based on a longitudinal or long-term study of families from the Vietnam conflict who had a husband or father who was held captive or was missing in action, MIA. Now, this model expanded upon Hill's ABCX model by adding the post-crisis variables to explain why some families adapt better than others. So here's what they added to the ABCX model. Additional life stressors and strains, psychological, intrafamilial, and social resources. Intrafamilial means within the family. Changes to the family's definition of the stressor over time. What we start with may change as time goes on. Fourth, family coping strategies. And fifth, a range of outcomes possible for the family. So let's move to the next slide. So the model has 3 stages, as you've seen already. There's the pre-crisis stage on the left. There's the crisis stage, see where the X in the triangle is in the middle, or roughly in the middle of the 3 parts. And then the post-crisis component, all across time. So they're all following the time scale. So let's turn to these individual pieces, starting with the pre-crisis stage by moving to the next slide. The pre-crisis stage involves the stressor, A, B, existing resources, which include psychological, which is the individual, the individual's psychological makeup, social and community resources, and intrafamilial, the resources that the family has inside the family. Now remember, the family is greater than the sum of its parts, greater than the sum of its individual parts. And so the family has resources that are not just the collective resources of the individual, but even greater than that. And it should not read family, it should read family. And then C, the family's perception of the stressor, which is the little a, right? So in the pre-crisis stage, you have the A, B, and C, just like the previous model. So let's move on to the next slide to see then what comes next. In the crisis stage, X, little x, stands for the introduction of the crisis. So while the ABCX model ends with the crisis, the double ABCX model goes on to include post-crisis variables, which we turn to in the next slide. So if you're ready, let's move on. So post-crisis, we've got little a, big A, which is the double A, little b, big B, which is the double B, little c, big C, which is the double C, the perception of the crisis, plus little a, big A, plus little b, big B. Now that's just complicated, but let's talk about these. Pile up then, little a, big A, is when the crisis and the stress begins to add and kind of like a snowball going downhill, get bigger. The little b, big B, what happens, so let me just go back to the pileup. So after the crisis, things can get worse when things begin to pile up and add on. Now, there's a little b, big B, which are resources in this case. And so some families have existing resources to cope, but some families then develop new resources like going to see a social worker or working with their church, their pastor, or some families from church, or working in their social support group, or drawing upon a social aid and pleasure club network, or so on and so forth, right? These are the existing resources, and then the new resources that come in post-crisis to help them cope. The little c, big C is their perception of the pileup and their perception of the resources, right? So if they, and of course the perception of the crisis, because if they don't see it as a crisis, it's not going to be such a big deal. So the perception of the crisis plus pileup plus resources, that is our little c, big C. A couple other variables are coping and adaptation. And so let's move on to exploring these in a little bit more depth. If you're ready, let's proceed. Okay, pileup can come from 5 sources. First, it can be a pileup brought about by the initial stressor. It could also be brought about by hardships that came from the initial stressor that increased or just kept going over time. It could also be brought about by transitions. If you're moving from one place in life to another place in life, or a transition like moving from being housed to being unhoused, or transition of losing a job or losing a spouse, a divorce, right, or a separation or losing a child. Fourth is the consequences of the family stressors, the family's efforts to cope with the stressors or hardships. And then fifth, the ambiguity the family feels within. They're unclear about what they should do. And in society, does society have a good definition of what we should do in this situation? Moving on then to the next slide, we will look at little b, big B. So little b, big B is, or double B, is existing and new resources. The little b, remember, represented resources that existed pre-crisis, while the big B represents new resources developed to deal with the crisis. So existing resources include things like friends, religion, mental health professionals, social workers, togetherness, role flexibility, shared values and goals, and emotional expressiveness, the ability to talk about what one's feeling. New resources then include educational opportunities to learn about how to cope with the situation, increased self-esteem that comes from coping with the situation, increased self-sufficiency, or the ability to cope brings about a stronger ability to rely on the family or rely on self. Reallocated roles and responsibilities which have to shift to deal with the crisis. New communities, new families, with which one can interrely. Community groups like counseling and church and clubs. All of these things are new resources that can develop as a result of a crisis or post-crisis. Now let's move to the next piece of the model, which is the double C. So the double C are the perceptions of double A, or crisis, plus double A plus double B. The C is the perception or the definition of the stressor that led to the crisis. While that's the little c, the big C is positive coping by family members. So again, little c, perception, definition of the stressor that led to the crisis. Big C is positive coping by family members. When the double C factor is positive, family members are better able to cope. Such families then give positive meanings to their situation. They see it as a challenge, an opportunity for growth, the Lord's will, etc. Instead of being, a terrible hardship to be overcome, it's just or endured. It's just a thing that's happening, and we'll get through it, right? When the double C factor is not positive, family members are less able to cope. That brings us to the next piece of the model, which is coping. So let's move to the next one. Coping is how well a family is able to cope with the stress. And how well they can cope with the stress influences how well they adapt to the changes and hardships they're facing. If a family doesn't cope well, they don't adapt well. If a family does cope well, they do adapt well, and they can reorganize themselves in their thinking to handle this challenge. Now, in the next slide, we will then look at adaptation. So let's move on. Adaptation can either be a process or an outcome. So by process, we mean we are adapting to this model. By outcome, we mean we have adapted to this problem. So it can either be what one does to adapt or what happens after one adapts. That's the definition of adaptation. So an outcome is the result of change in the family system, which has long-term consequences for changing the roles, patterns of interaction, perception of the family, and it occurs at a couple levels. The member, the individual, to the family, and then the family to the larger community. The process is the way they adapt, what they do along the way to adapt. When that adaptation is positive, known as bond adaptation, bond means good, so it would be good adaptation. Members are able to balance their member-to-family relationship with their family-to-community relationships. When it's negative, known as maladaptation, mal means bad, like malware is bad software put in your computer. So maladaptation, which is represented by the double X, which means they are, further having crisis. The results in harm to the family's integrity, harm to the family's development, and harm to the family's autonomy. They need to rely more on other people because they're not doing well. Their integrity or their organization is falling apart, and so they're not as solid of a family as they used to be. Their development has been impaired by this crisis, and their ability to function as a solo family unit is impaired because they're so reliant upon other people. So the next slide, we're just going to look one more time at this model, and then we will move on to the next elements. Okay, so the double ABCX model here is blown up for you. You can see this if you choose to go look for it in McCubbin and Patterson's 1983 Family Stress and Adaptation to Crisis, a double ABCX model of family behavior, which you'll find in Olson and Miller's Family Studies Review Yearbook, Volume 1, pages 7 to 37, published by Hainwood. But you see on the left the original single ABCX model, stressor, resources, perception, then the X, crisis. And then on the right, you see the double A, which is the pile-up or the amassing of the challenges. The double B, the old resources coupled with new resources. And the double C, which is their perception of the crisis, as a crisis, but also as a challenge to be overcome. So that's you can see how the coping connects to the A, B, and C, and then to the adaptation, which is either the family adapts bond adaptation and does well, they overcome the crisis, or they have maladaptation, further deepening the crisis, which is the double X. So there you have it, the double ABCX model, which is based on the ABCX model. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. So now, take the quiz on this lecture and move on to the next item in the module. You should have already read the chapter. If you haven't, please go back and read the chapter. I'm just skimming over this and not telling you as much as I should be. So go back and read the chapter. Then by Wednesday, post an initial post to the discussion board. By Saturday, you should have everything completed, including your posts to substantive post to 3 of your classmates. Okay? We will then see you in Module 5. Bye-bye.